You know, my salary probably had maybe a dozen receipts for these.
Really?
Now, how could someone eat that many hamburgers, still hate America?
The 9/11 terrorist attack is a moment that will be permanently cemented in American history. On September 11th, 2001, 4 passenger planes were hijacked mid-flight by al-Qaeda extremists in an attempt to destroy prominent American structures and cause mass hysteria. One plane hit a section of the Pentagon, another crashed into a field in Pennsylvania, and 2 crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, causing both buildings to collapse. None of the passengers survived. Almost 200 people died at the Pentagon, and of the nearly 3,000 people occupying the Twin Towers at the time, only 23 lived. Not counting the hundreds of firefighters, law enforcement members, and other rescue workers who gave their lives trying to evacuate the buildings. It remains the deadliest terrorist attack in human history, with thousands of people also dead or injured from the physical and mental fallout since the initial collapse, and stands as one of the most shocking moments in American, if not world, history. It's a tragedy with long-term consequences that affect the world to this day, including the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security that keeps a closer eye on suspicious activities in the country, the wars in both Iraq and Afghanistan, the latter of which is still being waged as of this writing, and, most unfortunately, a heightened sense of distrust and paranoia towards certain countries and cultures. Even over 20 years later, today's world is one concerned with security and prevention, arguably 2 extremes, where the question is often brought up, is our freedom secure, or are we trading our freedom for security? The tragedy was a sudden reminder to the American people that the rest of the world, well, existed, and that there are other cultures and beliefs to consider. A lot of advances in worldwide networking and online communities probably wouldn't exist today if not for the event, at least not in their current forms, and there's a larger push toward diversity in today's media than there was 20 years ago. Nowadays, we have more vocal calls for equal rights and representation, where many people of different races, cultures, and sexuality are being heard and seen as people. In theory, anyway. While I'm not saying 9/11 was the starting point for these views, or even necessarily the biggest contributor to these movements, I think the world today wouldn't have had as much of a push towards inclusiveness if not for the ramifications of the incident. A lot of other arguments could be made about what the event resulted in or helped bring to pass, but it's safe to say that it was a world-changing event that shaped how we live and think today, and it's a date that will never be forgotten. And 5 years later, in 2006, it allowed for a brief period of 9/11 exploitation. Yeah, I guess everyone figured that 5 years was a long enough grace period to let the dust settle, as that year saw a good amount of media based around different viewpoints and tellings of the events of that fateful day. There was United 93, about the plane that was redirected to and crashed into the field in Pennsylvania, Flight 93, a television movie about the same plane, and, possibly most famously, Oliver Stone's World Trade Center, detailing the rescue of 2 firefighters trapped under the rubble of the collapsed towers. While I haven't seen the first 2, I do remember seeing the World Trade Center movie in theaters. It's okay. Its heart is in the right place, but it's an unthrilling disaster movie that focuses too much on only one group of survivors, and not so much the scope of the disaster the movie is named for. It helps that it features Nicolas Cage and Michael Pena, 2 stars who always give a good performance, but it plays things too safe and underplays the impact of the disaster, while making some frankly unforgivable historical inaccuracies. Which is very surprising considering this is an Oliver Stone movie. A guy who's based his entire career around gritty, uncomfortable pushing the envelope to the point it's about to rip crime and political thrillers. And Conan the Barbarian. Maybe he was severely restricted by the studio what he could show, but if you're looking for an accurate, dramatic depiction of the tower's collapse and the ramifications that followed, this isn't the movie to tell you that story. And not wanting to be left out, the Asylum also contributed to that year's trend with their own telling of events, the 9/11 Commission Report. Based on the 2004 report detailing information related and leading up to the terrorist attacks. Unlike most of the other 9/11-centered media released that year, the Asylum's take doesn't tackle the events of and following that fateful day, but instead the events that preceded and may have triggered that disastrous event. An interesting and quite risky depiction of things, to say the least. And it's another rare movie made during this era of the Asylum not to be an obvious mockbuster. But, like Dracula's Curse before it, it was clearly made to capitalize on the zeitgeist that other, much more mainstream films were creating. And like Dracula's Curse, it's the passion project of a certain Lee Scott, the most eclectic and ambitious writer, director, producer working with the Asylum at the time. So what does a political thriller made by a studio that mainly specializes in cheap horror and monster movies look like? Would this be the one movie daring enough to tell the truth others would be too scared to accept? Or is it glorified exploitative garbage that boils one of the most traumatic days in American history down to a Steven Seagal movie? Well, any pun I use is going to sound tasteless, so let's just watch the movie. The plot, as far as I can interpret it, is a dramatization of 3 separate events detailed in the report that should have served as clues and warnings to a great disaster about to happen, and how it could have been prevented. In 1995, a terrorist is interrogated for information that leads to the revelation of a plan to hijack planes mid-flight and plant explosives that would destroy certain targets on American soil. In 1998, 2 agents uncover information that may lead to a terrorist ring, and possibly even the leader of Al-Qaeda himself, Osama bin Laden. And in 2001, mere weeks before the disaster, a Middle Eastern man requests to use a flight simulator with a very specific city and set flight path inputted, which sparks concern among the technicians and gains the interest of an FBI agent. Will these events be allowed to transpire and result in one of the most terrifying terrorist attacks the world has ever known? Yes, because we already know how this story ends. I am out of my league with this movie. This is yet another subject I never thought I'd be tackling when I started this look through the Asylum's back catalog, the historical conspiracy genre. It shouldn't come as any surprise that I'm not exactly an expert when it comes to conspiracies or the science and history required to understand how these groups form their conclusions. I'm a near middle-aged college dropout who plays video games and complains about bad horror and sci-fi movies. Badly. I don't even watch mainstream political thrillers, or even the news most days. Heck, I have to be reminded every other day who the president even is. Do I have my own political and cultural views? Sure, a lot of them. None of which I'm comfortable with sharing, and some which would probably get me put on a list somewhere. So it goes without saying that I follow the facts and views of this movie, as well as I follow traditional Filipino bench dances. I did try to get some background for this movie from other people who watched it, but surprise, surprise, not many people have seen this movie, much less talk about it, and the reviews I could dig up just reviewed the movie as a movie. A couple reviewers pointed out that some plot points were completely fictionalized, but didn't go into details which ones, so I was kind of sunk there too. And sorry, no, I'm not reading the 600-page document this movie supposedly gets its facts from. Not since Bellyfruit have I felt this woefully unprepared to tackle a movie's subject material. But since I promised a chronological look through Asylum movies, tackle it I will. Just keep in mind that I'm looking at this as a movie. So if there are any egregious fabrications or historical discrepancies about the events leading up to that day, I will completely miss them. Unlike what 3 of the Planes did. That was my one, that was the only one, you will not hear any remarks like that again, let's begin. So the style of this movie is a little hard to pin down. I know we referred to it as a political thriller earlier, but there's not much thrill or suspense to it. It's not a documentary, since there are no interviews or narration, and the events are clearly acted out. I guess the closest descriptor is docudrama, but since all the names have been changed and I can't attest to its historical accuracy, even that sounds wrong. What else can we call it? Docufiction? Well, it's based on real events, so that doesn't sound right. Let's just call it a docu-fiction drama and call it good. Trust me, the movie's hard enough to follow without having to worry about what genre to call it. As I mentioned, the movie is technically 3 movies, 3 storylines presented in a non-linear narrative, all detailing events leading up to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. One story will play out for a couple minutes, then it will cut away to another narrative, before either cutting back to the first or switching to another string of events. If you've seen Traffic or Syriana, or even the Bellyfruit movie I've already tackled, you have a good idea of this style. Except in this movie's case, the stories are told across time, with the events building on each other and coming to a head at the end of the runtime. So it's less parallel events portraying different perspectives of the same subject and more... The Fountain? Yeah, let's go with The Fountain. Thankfully, unlike that movie, the transitions aren't as hard to follow. Each timeline contains its own actors, none of whom interact with any other segment, and each segment is differently sepia-toned to set it apart. Though confusingly, instead of the earliest year being the most saturated and the most recent year the least, the level of saturation is at its weakest in 1998, followed by 2001 and 1995. I'd imagine they did this because most of the focus is on 1998, but it throws off how my mind is trained to recognize flashback tones, and I keep getting 2001 and 1998 mixed up. Even after watching these scenes multiple times, my brain just refuses to accept that the sections with the least saturation are in the middle of the timelines. It doesn't help that the transitions are completely random. We'll be watching 2001 for a short while, then it'll suddenly cut to 1998 with somebody doing something else. And unless you can identify each era's color tone, you'll quickly lose track of where and which time period these scenes are taking place in. I don't know how much crap to give this movie for sudden time shifts, since unlike some movies it does at least signal when it's from another perspective, but some kind of visual crossfade or audio indicator would have been nice. It's probably not as annoying as I'm making it sound, but if the flashbacks and flash forwards in something like Lost can sometimes be confusing, I recommend keeping a cast list and flowchart on standby. And if it sounds like I'm tap dancing around so I don't have to talk about the plot, I am. The movie has the dual problem of having too much plot and yet no plot. Throughout the movie, all the characters speak in pseudo-official jargon, like they want to sound important, when very few act like they know what they're talking about. Words are thrown around, names are dropped, and they state the importance of each situation like, well, thousands of lives are at stake, and yet I can't follow 90% of what anyone is saying. Sure, a conversation might sound important and crucial to preventing a major disaster.
Interagency cooperation is always appreciated, but the simple fact is we have more people on the ground there than they do. Bin Laden hasn't fully settled in. Now, no one's tried anything, so there's a good chance his defenses are down a bit.
Under what authority comes this action?
Well, there's the 86 Reagan executive order as well as the Reno indictment.
The information that we have supports that he finances terrorism and terrorist operatives, but that's it.
But our human intelligence directly contradicts that.
But to my ears, all the dialogue just sounds like... And a good chunk of that is likely because I can't follow these characters. Everyone in this movie is allegedly based on real people, just with the names changed for privacy. Which wouldn't be a problem if they still let me know who these people are. And they don't. There's a scene in 1995 where some government agents are arguing to keep a guy in the country until they're done interrogating him. Okay, who are these people? Who do they work for? Where do they stand in the federal food chain? Are they supposed to be doing this? Are we supposed to be rooting for the two suits who are secretly torturing a man for information? Heck, who are they torturing? What does he belong to? How do they know he knows what they want to know? And then there's this guy in 1998 who's been assigned to hunt down Osama bin Laden. Is he a federal agent, an undercover officer, a bounty hunter, a CIA operative? What authority does he hold? What qualifies him for this assignment? I respect wanting to respect the privacy of these individuals, but we still need to know who they are. We don't know thing one about any of these people, who they work for, why they're doing these things, who's pulling the strings, and how many strings everyone is given to pull. It's like joining a play right in the middle of the second act, after they're through with all the introductions and exposition and the inciting action has already been performed. Oh heck, not even that. Even when I only catch the tail end of a movie or watch a scene out of context, I can usually still identify the roles and personalities of the characters on screen. I've watched this movie multiple times, and I still don't understand who everyone is supposed to represent, what relationship they have to one another, or what they affect in the long run. If anything, because, again, we know how this story ends. Why couldn't we have had a visual rundown of these characters, like what the Da Vinci Treasure did? Or at the very least, some captions when we first see them that tells us who they are and what involvement they have. In fact, if this movie is based on a report, then why not have a written prelude to these scenes? Take snippets from the official document and use them to introduce the action that's about to occur. That way, we have context set up, and even if the dialogue is lost on us, we know what these people are ultimately saying and doing. Instead, it's like a bad adventure game, where the programmers severely overestimated how easy to follow their interface is, so we spend less time playing the game and instead spend hours upon hours playing guess what the programmers were thinking. Lee, come on! I know I usually get annoyed at how much exposition your characters spout, but here? Burst open the floodgates! Give us some context to who these people are and why we're supposed to care. Have these people be more like people, and not Disneyland animatronics giving us the audiobook version of the report. And telling us how much they hate karaoke.
I can't stand karaoke. Two worst things the Japanese ever brought to America. World War II and karaoke.
But don't worry, just in case you're scared of trying to follow along with an abridged version of an official government report, worrying that you'll get lost in all the doublespeak and jargon both book and movie spout, I can literally sum up all segments in one sentence each. In 1995, they torture someone into revealing they were planning to suicide bomb CIA headquarters and the terrorist ring is supposedly captured. In 1998, plans are made to capture Osama bin Laden, but the higher-ups declare it too risky and they miss their window of opportunity. And in 2001, an FBI agent is called in to investigate a man running a suspicious route on a flight simulator, but the ACU finds no threat, so, despite the agent's protests, they drop the investigation and release him. Bam! That's literally all you need to know. And that's pretty much all they give us. All the talk, all the discussions, all the warnings, all boil down to a one-sentence summary and fingers pointing at certain groups the movie suggests should have known better. Which, since I don't know the background to these events, and the movie doesn't exactly fill us in, I can't agree or disagree with their accusations. They could say David Hasselhoff was behind everything, and I couldn't argue with them. You know, that could have been a focus of the movie. The segments all revolve around building a case against certain individuals and organizations. Maybe they could have built their own, go into more detail about why one side is at fault, maybe even see things from that side's point of view. They wouldn't have to go into conspiracy nut territory, but some theory or explanation about why they were denied action by one side would have been nice. Because as presented, the same way I summarized all the subplots in one sentence, that's the same length of the reasons they give.
It's really quite simple. You say, Steven, I'm going back to my office and I'm putting this plan on the paper shredder. Bury it. Bury the whole damn thing.
So as you can imagine, this movie is really hard to follow along with. Whatever statements it's trying to make or history it's trying to teach are lost in a sea of jargon and context-less conversations that tell us all too much and yet not enough. When it comes to a cohesive plot and comprehensive events, this movie falls short in both departments and what we get is an incoherent mess. But with that said, it's an interesting incoherent mess. Yeah, this is where my relationship with the movie gets complicated. When I saw that this was next on the watch list, I was ready to hate it. I was already in a bad mood from the last movie, and now had to listen to the studio that brought us that give us their views and opinions on a tragedy the world is still reeling from. So going in, I was ready to tear this movie a new one. And I can't get as mad at this movie as I want to. Despite the problems I've already gone over, and the ones I'm about to address, the movie has a surprising amount of passion and even ambition put into it. It's not as obvious as Jane White, but it's clear that the people behind this, or at the very least writer-director Lee Scott, wanted to make it. And it shows! You just have to know what you're looking for. As you've probably guessed by this point, this movie is boring. I can't tell what's going on, what anyone is talking about, or what these people have to do with these events. But it's an interesting flavor of boring. The type where things are happening with no context, and yet it still gives the impression things are happening. It's like All the President's Men, or Primer, one of those movies that unapologetically refuses to dumb things down for their audience, for the most part, but we'll get to that, yet we have the impression that the writer knows what they're talking about, and that these events are building up to something. Heck, I've even seen a movie very similar to this, called Nothing So Strange, another super low-budget political reenactment-esque film that uses the fictional assassination of Bill Gates as an allegory for the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and how these facts and truth groups would be analyzed today. It's another movie where most of the dialogue flew right over my head, and where most of the runtime is taken up by filler that thinks it's more important than it is. And yet, despite it being a very personal, no-budget, no-attention flick I'd normally forget I saw after a week, I still remember it vividly, having not seen it in 15 years. Why? Because it was a movie that cared about what it was showing. Somehow, the writer-director's passion was able to manifest itself within the dialogue and plot structure, giving me the feeling that I should care about what's going on. So even though it was a very slow-paced film, also comprised of jargon and confusing transitions, I still remember a good chunk of it. And the same rings true of this movie. It's clear that this is a story that Lee Scott really wanted to tell, that he was really excited to bring an adaptation of the document to the screen and share his own take on what happened during those events. It's an intensity that radiates throughout the movie, giving energy to otherwise very boring scenes and pulling me into the action. Even if I didn't know what was happening, I felt like he did, and I wanted to know where he was taking me. And in that way, it's surprisingly one of Lee Scott's most captivating movies. And one of the more interesting movies from the Asylum to this point. I fully admit that I may be talking directly out of my ass, and I'm just spoiled by a movie that's mostly plot and not 95% thriller or meandering like most of the Asylum's catalog. But just sitting down and watching these events take place was surprisingly more engaging than they had any right to be. Kinda like watching a film dubbed in a language you don't understand. Yeah, you can tell the people making it had fun. Plus, if we can't understand the plot, we can just make up our own.
Hey, Awesome Claus, what did you do today?
Well, I made Christmas a whole lot more awesome this year.
On top of that, I appreciate the tone of the movie. It would have been so easy to simplify the conflicts between the US and Middle Eastern people into an us versus them story. The heroic United States of effing America versus the big bad Muslims who want to take away our truth, justice, and homemade apple pie. Why not? This is a studio that's established and knows no shame or taste, so why not Frank Miller the hell out of it? But, surprisingly, the movie presents itself in a mostly neutral stance. It establishes that it's not romanticizing or demonizing one side or the other, and it is, allegedly, just giving us the facts and telling us how it went down according to the document. And one part is even dedicated to showing that not all Muslims or Iraqi people share the terrorist views. In 1995, a friend of a terrorist planning a suicide bombing run decides to turn his partner in, because, well, that's crazy, and he wants nothing to do with it. He states up front that he doesn't agree with his friend's reasoning and that this is a fringe group of Muslims who are not living by the teachings they say they're acting on, that the Quran does not condone aggressors. And he doesn't have a problem with America and wants to move there. Admittedly, he admits he's doing this to collect on the reward placed on his friend, so he may just be saying these things to look good to the CIA agent and hopefully deter any future suspicion. But it is nice that the movie includes an event that doesn't paint all of one nationality or religion as jihad-shouting extremists. If this actually happened, which I don't know if it did, because if it didn't, this scene may be a little problematic, but it's a nice gesture anyway. I'll even say that the movie's neutral tone almost justifies the movie not giving us any information on these characters. That we're not supposed to know who these people are, because we're not supposed to take sides. The movie just wants to show us what happened, not defend it or give it an opinion. It's just a dramatization of events from the document. That's an interesting way to frame these events, based solely on how an outsider with no concept of these groups would perceive these actions. Events viewed in a vacuum, if you will. Now, I just stretched my reasoning around the moon and back 8 times to arrive at that idea, and I doubt that was the intention of the writer-director, but it's a way one could view it. In the same way one could study Disney Pixar's Inside Out and pick out winning lottery numbers, but it's a method. The cast features a lot of Asylum regulars, including some we haven't seen for a while, and some who would leave after this movie. Rhett Giles, Mark Glazer, Griff First, Sarah Leaving, Jeff Denton, Eliza Swenson, AJ Castro, Christina Rosenberg, Kim Little, Chris Anglin, Jason Gray, Deanna Arevalo, Noel Thurman, Jennifer Lee Wiggins, Spencer Jones, David Schick, Justin Jones, Erica Kessler, and Robert Pike Daniel all appear to some extent, from playing main characters to blink and you'll miss it background cameos. And while these names may sound mundane by this point, it is a testament to Lee Scott's clout and charisma that he was able to get these names. This top-tier talent associated with the Asylum to appear in a personal project that probably paid less and required more travel than usual, and to act out a script I highly doubt everyone fully understood. Speaking of which, Lee himself also appears in this movie as Jeff, one of the main characters, and probably his most prolific role to this point, exceeding his screen time from Dracula's Curse. And, like I said, at least he looks like he knows what he's saying. Like his previous appearance, this is another role where he doesn't die. Which, fine, he's supposedly playing a real person, so I'll grant him a reprieve. But Lee, you only got 4 Asylum movies left, and I'm getting worried this hiatus is making you rusty. So please die again soon. In character, I mean, of course. Please never die in real life. You're too entertaining to want to see go. Besides the usual names, we have a couple other actors who can claim this as their first, and in some cases only, Asylum movie. Which you'll forgive if I didn't feel like scanning through this movie again to hopefully identify, since 1, there are a lot of actors in this movie, and 2, I had a hard enough time identifying returning actors, and I couldn't be bothered to track down profile pics of the newcomers and find them in the sea of faces, especially since everyone is assigned incredibly simplistic names. But we do have quite a few names that either had or went on to have long careers in showbiz, including Paraj Puri, who recently produced The Mediator with Ice-T, and possibly most notably Barry Ratcliffe, who would work on a number of Lee Scott productions, but is probably most well known as the guy who plays the auctioneer and everything. Again, nice to see a name in a project from before they became a name. The acting in this movie is, well, let's be nice and say, restrained. Most of these performances lack a lot of the energy these actors have previously shown in other Asylum movies. Which, given that everyone was probably on an even tighter deadline than usual and they were expected to make these lines sound natural, I fully understand. But given the tone is supposed to be more quote-unquote realistic than most of their other roles, it works to the movie's advantage. It's a much more serious movie than most of the Asylum's churn out, and most of the portrayals match that atmosphere. And the actors, who only had one tone to begin with, fit in much better here than in a fantasy or sci-fi flick. Though ironically, that also means the worst performances come from the Asylum's most talented actors. Kim Little makes a brief return, and while she's giving her usual 110%, she should have knocked it down to 35%. It's not her fault, she's giving us the acting style we know and love her for, and probably what she was asked to do, but her overacting contrasts so terribly against everyone else's underacting that she comes across as less the Kim Little we know, and more like the sister from Troll 2.
How long have you two been here?
Well, we got here just a few minutes before you did.
Bullshit. Who the do you think you are?
Come on, Jamie.
Our own people are in on the arrest, and I have to wait 2 days for a call from a Japanese bomb investigator before I even know what's going on?
Well, we're all here now, Jamie.
Who do you think I am? We're talking about a man that has a federal warrant issued against him that is my jurisdiction. He already has a warrant. You know that.
If my father discovers you here, he'd cut off your little nuts and eat them. He can't stand you.
The same applies to Rhett Giles, who, throughout the movie, plays his part less like a subtle political thriller and more like a Bruce Willis movie. Except he's not allowed to have a sense of humor. So a modern Bruce Willis movie. Again, I don't know who he's supposed to be, but his action-star demeanor does not match the more realistic and down-to-earth world this story is set in. And the random sex scene Lee likes to insert in his movies doesn't help me to take him seriously. Look, I love Rhett Giles. This guy is a fantastic actor. But his portrayal here feels out of place. Less All the President's Men and more Mission Impossible. And if I want to watch someone try to be Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible, I will watch Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible. Surprisingly, the technical work isn't that bad, or at least not as bad as you'd assume from a movie that looks like this. The sound editing is probably the movie's best feature. There are a lot of scenes filmed indoors and other enclosed spaces, and it's all kept coherent. There's a lot of reverb, but it's echo that matches where the scene is taking place. When they're filming in an office, it sounds like an office. When they're in an underground base, it sounds like an underground base. The reverb is never so bad I can't hear the characters speaking, and the microphone, for the most part, is kept close to the actors, so we don't get horribly distracting fluctuations as the camera and actors move around. They clearly redubbed the dialogue for scenes filmed outside and where not all of the characters were on set at the same time, but the ADR work is kept on the same level as the audio recorded indoors. So I never had to constantly fiddle with the volume, and ambiance that fits the location is added in to make the change in quality less obvious. A couple reviews I read said that the dubbing was off by full seconds in some places, but maybe it's my copy, but I never noticed any sync issues. And while there's ambient background noise and the occasional loud stock sound effect, they never overpower the dialogue. So no matter where these actors are, I can hear every word spoken. So yeah, this production has some of the most professional audio work I've heard in an Asylum movie, which is either a tribute to the sound crew and editors, or a condemnation of the studio in general. The only issue worth bringing up is that for some scenes, either they didn't have a pop filter or the actor was too close to the mic, but there are clear pops in Rhett Giles' audio.
I think they're gonna go for it.
They better. They'll be pissed if this is all for nothing. It's not his business. If the president authorizes the job, we do it.
Oh, poo! I never pop my peas.
Wacko, we got a big pee pop on poo. Can we have that again?
The editing, for the most part, is also okay. It's a very basic editing job, with no transitions, no speed-ups, no effects, and no filters, outside of the shades of sepia that indicate when the segment is taking place. It just looks like someone put it together in a bare-bones video editor, which I could consider lazy and impressive if I hadn't seen multiple movies by this point where transitions and editing tricks caused instant migraines. Less is more when it comes to this era of Asylum movies. And the movie is surprisingly paced well. I don't remember any scenes that felt like they lasted just short of forever. Everything feels relevant, and the movie does a great job of switching between multiple shots to keep scenes from getting monotonous and stale. So while it's a boring 80 minutes, it's a surprisingly breezy 80 minutes. However, the movie does have two parts where the editing just crashes and burns. The first is during the sex scene, which is already pointless, and the movie itself seems anxious to get over with, since it constantly switches back and forth between the sex and the awkward aftermath. I have no idea what that scene was going for, and I didn't need the painful Frankenstein Reborn flashbacks. And then we have this little hiccup.
What?
Sit down!
Ah! You have the right to remain silent. Are you arresting me?
I don't have a joke. What you saw was enough of one. Music is practically non-existent. Most scenes are accompanied by either ambient noise or complete silence, save for some of the quieter or more action-packed parts of the movie. And the tracks they play during these sections would have fit perfectly in a documentary also detailing the 9/11 attacks. Honestly, the lack of music doesn't bother me, and the silence that accompanies most of the scenes aids the atmosphere of dread and seriousness the movie conveys. I mean, you could play the Torres Gamlas song over it. I'm not going to. But let's address the elephant in the room you've been waiting for me to bring up since the footage started playing. The camera is not very good. I've criticized movies in the past that were clearly shot on handhelds and or with very unstable camera operators, but this one I think takes the cake. Not only is it shot on the cheapest camera I think I've seen since Social Intercourse, not only is the footage in 4:3 in 2006, but the camera never, ever stops moving. From minute 1 to minute end, the screen is always shaking, always wobbling around, and often positioned at angles that throw off the framing of the shot. Every single scene looks like a struggle to get everyone in frame, like they used every practice take that was done while the operator was trying to set up a shot. Even scenes where everyone's just sitting around talking look like they were filmed in the middle of the earthquake. Was the tripod not in the budget? Would they have fined you for sitting the camera on a shelf? Could you have swapped out camera operators while one recovered from the 6 frappuccinos that just downed? Or was little Petey's 5th grade What My Family Did During Spring Vacation video report really the style you were aiming for? It's not even a consistent shaking. Some shots are practically still, barely noticeable, and some, especially those that take place outside, make Cloverfield look like a still frame. And don't get me started on when they attempt tracking shots or more artsy filming techniques. This is awful, truly nauseating camera work and framing, and another contributor to why I can't handle shaky cam anymore. Once upon a time, I could stomach found footage and unsteady framing in movies, but just like how The Surge and a couple movies afterwards ruined my tolerance for wide flash transitions, films like this are the reason I get nauseous during even mild camera shaking now. And the only reason I'm not calling this camera work worse than The Surge is because they don't try for weird angles or purposely rock the camera from side to side. But yeah, I'm perfectly comfortable with calling this the second or third worst camera work I've seen yet in an Asylum film. If sudden movements and shaky footage nauseate you faster than one of those gyroscope rides, then grab a puke pail before pressing play on this movie. But I have to play devil's advocate again, because there may be a reason for why the camera is so bad. You see these shots that look like England, or Morocco, or Washington, D.C.? Well, that's because they were actually shot in England and Morocco and Washington, D.C. In another landmark for the studio, this is one of the first, if not the first, Asylum flicks to be shot on location. Unlike the Da Vinci Treasure, which utilized stock footage in nearby areas that resembled the countries the film called for, they actually flew the cast and crew to the actual locations the movie takes place in. Which, for an Asylum movie, is certainly ambitious. And no doubt expensive, especially for a film made on $1 million or less. So, with that in mind, it could be argued that it was just too expensive to bring along an actual film crew. That, on top of actor, director, and other crew salaries, not to mention transportation and other costs, it just wasn't feasible to pack a decent camera or other video equipment. So whatever cameras they could fit in their bags or buy on location were the best they could work with. On top of that, they may have run into the slight issue of legality. I noticed that only the city of Los Angeles is credited for granting filming permits, so when they were shooting footage in other countries and states, they may straight up not have had permission to film a movie. But rather than let a little matter like that stop them, they decided to go guerrilla with their footage. Whatever they couldn't film away from the prying eyes of the law, they took a cue from Escape from Tomorrow and just disguised their shooting as vacation footage. which may explain why outdoor shots are much shorter than indoor scenes, and why the camera is too close to or so far away from the actors most of the time. Movie? What movie? We're just a bunch of work buddies enjoying our business trip to Washington, D.C. Just let us get a few shots of the White House for the folks back home. And hey, we'll believe we went to Morocco if I don't film the busy street right outside my hotel room. I have nothing to back this up. I found absolutely no behind-the-scenes information on the making of this movie, but that is my best guess based on what little I could find, and my best defense for why the camera work is so bad. I'd imagine with the rush to film these scenes without getting caught, plus the rush to finish filming in order to make the flight to the next location, on top of the budget and time constraints a normal Asylum movie already has to contend with, that setting up a shot and getting the framing perfect wasn't a luxury they could afford. Does this make the movie look better? No. Did they have to sacrifice quality just to say they filmed on location? Not necessarily. But it is impressive that they managed to pull off what even big-budget flicks can struggle with getting the rights at time to do. Again, I have to stress that I have no proof this is what happened. I do not intend to slander anyone with false accusations, and I could be romanticizing the making of this film. But if that story is true, could we see a featurette about that? So despite most of the movie flying completely over my head and me only catching on to every third line at best, I did watch the flick all the way to the end. And for the most part, the movie stays consistent with its format and level of writing. And I was just ready to say it's a smart movie, I'm just not smart enough to follow along with it. And then we get the ending. And as immature and frustrating as this is about to sound, it kind of made me feel angry and insulted. Back in 2001, the alleged terrorist who's been practicing how to fly a plane is released due to lack of evidence, much to the disgust and resentment of the FBI team looking into the matter. And it's here where the smart, realistic writing that most of the movie had turns into baby's first conspiracy movie. I can't even, just watch this.
Ideas?
Deport him. Get him the f*** out of here.
That's right.
No, we can't do that. He's part of something bigger. I know it.
How do you know it's something bigger? I mean, what's telling you?
I don't know. It's like a sixth sense or something, you know?
Did the movie really just have one of its characters claim to have a premonition about the event? Is it actually going full The Haunting of Sharon Tate and claiming that someone based on a real person just so happened to metaphysically foresee the great disaster about to happen? No, thankfully it doesn't go that far, but still, no. No. You don't get to do that, movie. You don't get to mostly play out as an accurate adaptation of a government document written years after the fact, then suddenly slip in a character who says, you know, I have a feeling that something big and bad is about to happen. Not only does that not match the rest of the tone, it destroys all credibility you worked so hard to establish. Because now that you've suddenly introduced a psychic character who just so happened to predict the towers are gonna fall, that calls into question every single other thing you've said. It's like at the end of Schindler's List, Schindler freed the Jewish people, then beamed up to the mothership. That's not only insane, it makes the rest of the movie look like fiction. That one line, that seemingly unimportant slipped-in line, ruins the movie for me. Even if the rest of the movie is telling the truth, it's that one line that means I can no longer take it seriously. And the rest of the scene doesn't help the movie gain back credibility. Because then the characters suddenly reveal that they have all the information from the previous teams in 95-98, and instantly come to the conclusion that there's a secret ring of terrorists ready to hijack commercial planes and crash them into various monuments. Including, the World Trade Center buildings. You know, just a hunch everyone suddenly comes up with. Convenient, I know. And from there, they basically spell out the events of 9/11, to the point I almost expected the twist to be that they were the hijackers. Then they work out a plan to stop this event that is for sure 100% gonna happen just because they have a feeling it will, and the scene becomes an episode of Scooby-Doo.
We can't just deport this guy, we gotta follow this up.
What if we do deport him? We deport his belongings later?
What's that gonna do?
The airlines are constantly losing my luggage. So it's not that inconceivable that we might lose a couple things.
And if we search his belongings over international waters, we're not breaking any laws.
I like it. I guess first thing tomorrow, we'll push for deportation.
Okay, everybody, we put a bar of soap in the spray container. Turn on the water, and instant suds.
And see that ramp? We suds it up, he slips, and we hose him right over into that net.
Musawi joined a gym, right? Took up kickboxing classes. He had shin guards and knives on him when we arrested him. Small teams of 5. They take control of a plane. They turn commercial airliners into weapons of mass destruction.
That's why Miss Sally wanted to know so much about fuel payloads.
That night on the beach, Cutler was storing extra scuba tanks.
But like his diving suit got covered with that kooky glowing seaweed.
That was some plan they had. First spreading the phony story about Cutler, and then stealing the yachts from the marina.
And that's where the glowing ghost story came from.
And in the end, what does this scene accomplish? Why was it so important for the movie to share its theory that there was a group who just so happened to know the exact terrorist group and exactly what they would do in a couple weeks? And that they failed because, oh, we just didn't listen and bureaucracy and human rights groups got in the way. And that's another thing. They failed. We know how events turned out. So this whole round table planning segment right at the end goes absolutely nowhere. I don't get this scene. After nearly 80 minutes of the movie just reciting events for the official report, we suddenly get 4 minutes of these characters, who, again, we have very little context for, who just so happen to figure out the whole plot and know exactly what needs to happen to prevent it. And again, it calls into question how accurate the rest of the movie is. Did the endings to the other timelines also occur as depicted? Or were those also romanticized what could have happened? These couple of minutes undermine the entire movie's credibility. And if these are real people, then it's arguably insulting and tasteless to those who served and even died trying to prevent this event. Needless to say, if I was making this, I would have just cut out these last few minutes. Have the ACLU guy tell the FBI guy they have nothing on the suspected terrorist, show the FBI guy disappointed and upset, maybe show the rest of his group in a somber mood and the future hijacker being released, then cut to the final shots of September 11th and a plane taking off. Bam! A hard message that sometimes the right groups help the wrong people, and that a forest fire can't be snuffed by just extinguishing one tree. No sudden psychic gut reactions or a group spontaneously reveal that they have all the facts, or a movie wagging its finger at us like it's our fault and if we had only listened, nothing would have happened. At least, that's how I interpret this scene. Maybe I'm stupid, don't put that past me, and this actually happened and I just insulted a brave band of people who attempted one final push against a terrorist plot, and the writer who wanted to tell their story. Or maybe this was a studio mandate to give a quick explanation of the movie to anyone who couldn't follow along, and it went overboard in dumbing things down for its audience. But whatever the reason, and even if it is the truth, it doesn't match the rest of the tone at all. And it makes the rest of the movie as credible as claiming the Titanic was saved by a giant octopus. Just the fact that they know their exact plans, their exact targets, and that the people in each timeline are all allied with the exact same terrorist group? Well, after the fiasco coming up, I see a future for them in the stock market. As long as they pack it in before 2008. This movie is... this movie. I'm sorry to say I don't have much of an opinion on it. It's not my kind of movie, and it requires knowledge about a subject I'm not well versed in. I had no idea what anyone was talking about, and only a bare outline of the plots in general. Is the history accurate? Are the politics reasonable? I couldn't tell you. The only thing I could do was review it like a movie, and I think it was as fair as I could possibly be in that department. That it's bad, but it's a passionate type of bad. It's important to keep in mind that this is a very personal project for a very specific type of audience, of which I'm not one of, but I could still recognize the effort that went into it. As confusing as the writing is, and as bad as the camera looks, I could still find reasons to defend those aspects. And even if a lot of it looks like someone's vacation footage they hastily edited together into some semblance of plot-driven movie, well, I could tell the tread for a plot-driven movie. It's far from the worst thing from the Asylum I've watched. I have seen so much vapid, soulless garbage from this studio that clearly nobody involved wanted to make. I don't even think it cracks the top 20. It's clear that Lee Scott was passionate about this project. I just wish I shared his enthusiasm. So if you're looking for a very personal, low-budget political conspiracy thriller, well, this is one of them. I'm so out of my element, I can't even say if it's a good one or a bad one. To me, it's just one. And if my inability to tell you what's going on and give a final consensus means I failed to properly review this movie, then yes, I fully admit that I failed. I will leave it up to someone else to give this movie the attention it deserves and properly judge if it's a good or bad example of its genre. Because for me, I followed this movie as well as the hijackers followed their predetermined flight plans. Sorry, I couldn't resist. I'm done now. Goodbye! Okay, this was a brain-hurting experience. I need something easy for the next one. What's next on the chopping block? You know, I think I need another slasher movie right now. See you for some gourd-smashing fun next time! Hey there everyone, thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider supporting me on Patreon and help me create even more content like this. It's only $1 to get early access to my videos, and only $5 gets you a credit at the end of each of those videos, with higher tiers offering these and even more perks. And as you help me reach certain goals, I have super special content lined up for all of you. Head on over and check out my Patreon today, and I'll see you next time.